After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. It's becoming clearer by the day what a disastrous decision it was for the United States and Israel to launch a war on Iran. Thousands have died in a conflict with no legal justification. Despite boasting about its overwhelming force and a war without mercy, the US has lost the upper hand in the conflict, according to many analysts. And its inability to plan for Iran's response has led to a series of economic disruptions that may be impossible to reverse. Unable to do very much about it, Donald Trump is doing what he does best, blaming others.
Because we spend trillions of dollars protecting Europe, protecting the countries of NATO. They weren't there for us. For small time. This is small time. You know what? Venezuela is a big deal, but it's not the big one. They weren't there.
With me to talk about what's going on in Iran, in US domestic politics, and the Australia-US relationship is Dr. Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs here at the Australia Institute. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Angus, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad. 3 times in 3 weeks. Huge.
They'll be getting sick of us.
No, they'll be getting sick of me, not so much sick of you, I think.
Nonsense.
Let's start with the war in Iran. It feels very much like things are going nowhere very quickly for the United States. Is that fair?
I think they're going worse than nowhere. Since we last spoke, things have gotten even worse, really, for the United States. Of course, they've gotten worse for Iran too, but in terms of, how the United States is prosecuting this war, even what its aims are, has become even more cack-handed, even more unclear. And I think that's evidenced by a number of things, the most obvious perhaps being a missile and drone attack on the Prince Sultan airbase in Saudi Arabia that happened over the weekend and wounded 12 US soldiers, too seriously, when we consider that the Saudi ruling house has been, I think, considering becoming more involved and has been encouraging the United States to go harder as well, by all reports. That's, one of a number of very deep concerns. There are also a number of reports, particularly one broken by Reuters, which is saying that intelligence sources in the US are saying that they can only be certain they've destroyed around a third of Iran's missile and drone arsenal. So, that's a bit, but when you compare it to what Trump is saying about, obliterating Iran, when you compare it to what Hegseth is saying, those two things don't really match up.
And so I've also seen reports that the US is considering a ground invasion of Iran. Military and defense types are prone to using chess analogies,
aren't they?
Often really poorly. But rather than a stalemate, there's a term in chess called Zugzwang, which means like compulsion move, where you're in a position where all of your available decisions are self-defeating and ultimately bad. It feels like that's where the United States is now. That's where they've got themselves.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, I'm not a chess dork like you, but yeah, it does seem to be in an entirely self-defeating position. So the Wall Street Journal is reporting that the Pentagon is considering sending 10,000 more troops. There's already 7,000 on their way to the Middle East. And this has been confirmed again by reporting in the Washington Post based on insider sources. So, to use another term that security boys love using, it does seem like the United States is stuck in an escalation trap where, because the strategy isn't clear and because of this, to use another stupid term, asymmetric situation that we've got going between the United States and Iran, the momentum is always toward escalation. And certainly that's what the Israeli government wants. That's very clear. It seems that that's what Pete Hegseth wants. And it is it is just extraordinary to watch. Like, even when you know how dumb this administration is, like we both listen to them speak enough to know that. Like, to see them just play out even dumber versions of what we've already seen before, to see this play out as a potentially even dumber version of Vietnam, to the point where people in the Pentagon, this is all hearsay reporting, but it kind of feels right, but to the point where people in the Pentagon are apparently calling Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, dumb McNamara.
Jeez.
In reference to Robert McNamara, who's famously, Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, and who was obsessed with numbers. We've killed this many Viet Cong, we've destroyed this many of these assets, we've destroyed this many trucks or whatever, and that being a way of measuring success. And when you listen to Hegseth speak, it's the same thing. We've destroyed this many targets, blah blah blah, and it's all meaningless because Iran has this ability to disrupt so significantly, and is committed to survival. The regime is committed to survival and just has to wait out the United States. It's so, talk about asymmetry and learning the lessons of history. It is genuinely wild.
But it's in their interest. It's in their national interest. The United States is constantly being asked to help in a war, and we have more than any other country in the world, on a war that's happening in another continent, in Ukraine.
They have to open it up. They have to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Excuse me for this. I'm so sorry. Such a terrible mistake. The fake news will say he accidentally said, no. There's no accidents with me, not too many.
One of the immediate challenges we're going to face is an Iran that may decide that they want to set up a tolling system in the Straits of Hormuz. Not only is this illegal, it's unacceptable, it's dangerous to the world. And it's important that the world have a plan to confront it.
So lots of the focus, particularly globally, is around the Strait of Hormuz because of its impact on global trade, particularly energy exports from the Middle East. What's the latest there?
It's really about the same as last time we spoke. A few ships are getting through the strait. A few governments have been able to negotiate directly with Iran to allow for safe passage. But mostly it's closed. Ships just aren't able to get through. And, from a strategic point of view, that makes total sense for Iran to keep doing that. It's one of its huge strategic advantages over the United States. And, it's kind of tricked the Trump administration into now saying that one of its aims in the war that it started is to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which is only closed because of the war it started, right?
Yeah.
We're in this ridiculous kind of doom loop. And you can see the administration flailing about, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has said that Iran holding on to control of the strait is unacceptable. The president he works for has said that there could be a joint US-Iranian co-administration of the strait. What?
And who's in control of it? Will Iran still be able to control the flow of oil?
Be jointly controlled.
By who?
Maybe me. Maybe me.
You want the United States to be in
Me
control?
and the Ayatollah, whoever the Ayatollah is.
I can imagine a massive sign with the Trump-Iran toll booth over the Strait of Hormuz. I imagine he'd love it.
Oh my God, he would. And look, it also just keeps getting worse because of the way that this war is spilling out into the region. So the Houthis have joined the war, I suppose, against Israel in particular, launching strikes against Israel over the weekend, which they have done before, of course. And now the Houthis can endanger another strait at the southern end of the Red Sea. So we could see an escalation of problems with shipping in and out of the Middle East. And so this is where, we've talked before about this war spiraling very quickly out of Trump's control. You can see that happening on a number of fronts, where they just clearly haven't planned for this potential outcome.
Yeah. And so I want to get into the global implications. Obviously, it's important for fuel, but also for other stuff. And I read a story over the weekend that suggested that the UK could be a few weeks away from medicine shortages. That seems very, very bad.
Yeah, it's not ideal. So as you mentioned, the focus has been on oil and gas, on energy supplies getting through the strait, but it's also things like fertilizer and helium, all stuff that's kind of used as the basis, I guess, for production lines. But it's also things like generic drugs and pharmaceutical ingredients, a lot of which, particularly the generic brands, are manufactured in India. So they get shipped from India into Europe and into the UK. I don't like, my geography is not that good, but basically it has to go through the Middle East. And it's, of course, the disruption is not just to shipping. It's not just a seaborne trade through the Strait of Hormuz. It's also air freight that's being disrupted because, again, most of that air freight goes through Middle Eastern hub airports, through Dubai, through Doha, and so on. And the war has effectively doubled air freight costs to the United Kingdom. So there is real potential for things like medicine shortages, but also, I guess, in the more medium term, for price hikes. So the price of medicine in hospitals is controlled through the National Health Service in the UK, but that doesn't necessarily apply to things like GPs. And so, you potentially see, once again, these kind of cascading effects that the Trump administration, has shown no care for. Like, we've said again and again, Trump doesn't care about allies and what this does, but it's just, I think, another reminder of how, what the Trump administration does is actually a direct threat to the national security of the United States' traditional allies. Like, what is a medicine shortage if not an issue of national security? Now, it's not that serious yet, but it all depends, of course, on how long the war goes for, and nobody knows how long it's going to go for. And so even predicting, mitigating the worst effects is incredibly difficult when you're working with a president who is so volatile and so uncaring about the impact of his actions.
Yeah. There had been talk of a global coalition to kind of secure the strait, and a bunch of countries, I know, signed a declaration. What are the prospects of that?
I mean, probably not great would be my guess. Like, what are they going to do? I think that those 22 countries that signed that declaration, including the UK, including Australia, including New Zealand, have an interest in the strait reopening. They have a deep interest in shipping and freight remaining open and free. Like, that's one of the underlying systems of international law that we've been talking about, that contributes to our safety and to our prosperity. So they have a real interest in the strait reopening. But again, how do they do that without being further drawn into the conflict? I think it's probably more likely that eventually, again, depending on a number of things, including how long this goes for, that those countries go directly to negotiations with Iran. Like, they actually circumvent the United States in a way that some other countries have already done, including China, including, I believe, India.
Yeah, Pakistan had got some ships through as well.
That's right. So I think that's probably more likely. Again, it just shows, the appalling position that the Trump administration has put its allies in.
Yeah. And so just before we move into US domestic politics, I wanted to ask about Lebanon, because the situation there seems to be getting pretty dire.
Yeah, it is pretty dire. And again, even more dire than last time we spoke. So the death toll is approaching about 1,500 people in Lebanon. Nearly 4,000 people have been wounded, including nearly 50 healthcare workers, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health. And again, it's worth emphasizing that there's always a delay on these numbers and they're always underestimates. And that's, I guess, particularly concerning when the Israeli government, again, over the weekend has talked about expanding that war on Lebanon. It's talking again about taking territory, and it is behaving very much in the same way that it has behaved in Palestine. So over the weekend, for example, Israel killed 3 journalists in Lebanon, which by all standards, is a war crime. Killing journalists is a war crime again, but though that's entirely consistent with how the Israeli Defense Forces have conducted themselves in the war on Palestine, and they're now extending that out into the war on Lebanon. And the Israeli government is playing this really dangerous role, of course, not just in Palestine, not just in Lebanon, but in its overall approach to Iran and the region. So Pakistan, which is a relatively neutral actor in this conflict because it's not home to US bases and it has relatively stable relationship with the Iranian regime, has effectively volunteered to act as a diplomatic broker between the two parties and has said that both parties want to talk. They're not at the point of direct talks yet, but basically Pakistani officials would act as kind of trusted runners between the two parties, passing on messages. But the Pakistanis have openly said that they're really concerned that Israel will sabotage the talks, which it has done before. And it's signalling that it will do that again. Israeli Defense Forces bombed two of Iran's steel manufacturing plants last week. They've also attacked civilian nuclear strikes. The Iranian regime claims that they've hit two universities. 2,000 people have been killed, 25,000 people are injured. There's evidence as well that the United States is using cluster munitions in Iran. The Iranians are also using cluster munitions in their attacks against Israel. So even establishing the groundwork for talks is incredibly difficult. And again, the Israeli government, particularly Netanyahu, has an active interest in those talks not going ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, that looks like evidence of that downward spiral that we were talking about in terms of the rules of armed conflict, and I guess shows how much harder it can make it to come back and deal with the situation through diplomacy when you're throwing aside those rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving into US domestic politics, sort of, there was a Department of Defense request recently for more money, quite a lot more money for the war in Iran. What was that about?
Yeah, so the Trump administration has actually requested $200 billion in additional funding for the Department of Defense, on top of the department's annual budget of, let me see if I get this right, $838.7 billion. They just need an extra $200 billion. Yeah. So that original budget was approved by Congress in January, and now the Trump administration is requesting $200 more through what's called supplemental appropriations. That formal request hasn't actually, I think, been put to Congress yet. Democrats and Republicans have been kind of trading barbs about it and what they will do. But the request might come to Congress actually even before this show comes out on Tuesday morning. So watch this space. Republicans have the votes to do it, and they probably will. There's no indication that, they would defy Trump on this when they don't defy him on anything else.
And I mean, the classic one or two Democrats that always cross the floor to vote with it as well.
Yeah, exactly. You can rely on Fetterman or someone like that to do it. And again, this is not just, of course, Trump is a product of American history. Historically, Congress has always been willing to give more money to defense. I mean, it's the same kind of in Australia, really.
The budget is nearly $1 trillion.
Yeah, it's insane. But I mean, as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said, it takes money to kill bad guys.
Yeah. As you say, simultaneously really dangerous and really fucking embarrassing. Yeah. In the US as well, the government is still partially shut down. The Department of Homeland Security, their funding lapse has now become the longest in US history.
Has it?
Yeah.
Cool.
According to, I think, NBC, I was reading last night.
Yep.
And there's some crazy shit going on in airports, including some really sad stuff. What is going on?
So the Department of Homeland Security, as you say, is kind of the focus of this funding fight. It has been partially defunded. So Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is still being funded. But the Transport Security Administration has been, defunded as part of this process. And so there aren't TSA agents in airports. The people who manage airport security lines are not being paid. And so, unsurprisingly, a lot of them are not showing up for work, and they haven't been paid for weeks. And so American airports are just in total chaos, where you see security lines, quite literally snaking outside of airports, and people waiting insane amounts of time, missing flights. And it's gotten, as you say, to a really quite dangerous point, because it's also affecting things like air traffic control. That's part of the reason that airports have slowed down. And at LaGuardia Airport in New York, there was a collision between an Air Canada plane and a fire truck in which two pilots were killed. And reporting suggests that, part of the reason this happens was because of extreme strain on the system, where there were only two air traffic controllers in the towers, and one of them was doing two jobs, so they're under extreme pressure. And I think anyone who's been to an airport in the States in the last maybe decade, 2 decades would know, you can actually feel, I think, that kind of undercurrent of barely controlled chaos and violence. And so it doesn't feel surprising that they're kind of teetering on the brink and in some senses being pushed over. And now, because all of this is happening as well, Trump has used the opportunity to deploy ICE agents in airports to kind of do TSA agents' jobs, but also not, because they're not trained. So again,
they can't even do their own jobs.
Exactly. Great point. And, the administration's doing that thing where it says they're not going to be doing TSA agents' jobs because they're not trained, but then there's video footage emerging of them doing TSA agents' jobs. There's also lots of footage, doing the rounds of the internet of ICE agents just literally just kind of wandering around, talking to each other, eating snacks, not doing anything while people are waiting in hours-long lines.
Which, given the circumstances, might actually not be such a bad result.
Well, yeah, I was reading some reporting by this great independent journalist that we can link in the show notes, saying that, generally the sentiment that she's reading in those airport lines is well, at least they're not shooting us. Imagine that being the situation. I know.
Yeah. So on the prevailing sentiment, I guess, in the US, there was another round of big No Kings protests over the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
They were predicting millions of people. Was that borne out?
Yeah, it looks like it. Again, it's hard to get accurate numbers because pretty much everyone has an interest in, giving their own version of the numbers. But from what I can tell, the guesses are from anywhere between the low end of 4 million up to about 9 million across major cities of the United States. Again, kind of depends who you ask. The general consensus,
is that a Trump 4 million or an actual 4 million?
I think it was I would guess that it was closer to 9. Just judging. I mean, I'm hopeless at maths, but just judging by the pictures of Boston, for example, and how many people were there, and if you add that up across major cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and given that the last one in October is kind of generally accepted to have included about 7 million people, it seems unlikely that number would have gone down given the circumstances. So, this is significant Democratic grassroots opposition to the Trump administration on a number of fronts. That is unsurprisingly being dismissed by the administration as, I think they called it, a Trump derangement syndrome therapy session or something like that.
I mean, arguably, that's what this podcast is, right?
Yes, it's definitely.
Just you and me talking about our feelings.
Do have a lot of them.
No doubt. Speaking of feelings and someone who has a lot of them, Donald Trump.
You've been really honest about how disappointed you are in Sir Keir Starmer, particularly in relation to Iran.
I think he's a lovely man. I do. I think he's a lovely man. But I think he did something that was shocking. He didn't want to help us. And maybe in particular that country, we were the longest bond, the longest ally. Australia, too. Australia was not great. I was a little surprised by Australia. I wouldn't say anybody was great other than the 5 countries in the Middle East. We never really had very much support.
He is cranky at a lot of people. He's been pretty cranky at UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, and that relationship is a little spicier than usual. He's also cranky at us.
Yeah.
Saying we weren't very helpful or something along those lines.
Yeah, he was surprised that Australia didn't contribute more.
Yeah, right. What have you made of the Australian government's response to all of this?
I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that it kind of is surprising, historically speaking, that Australia hasn't already contributed more. The government has, of course, committed that wedge-tail surveillance aircraft that's, as they describe it, is operating in defence of the United Arab Emirates. And it did, as we discussed at the time, it was the first, really Albanese was the first world leader to jump out of the blocks to support this war on Iran. But since then, they have kind of quietly walked back their support, which led to, Trump saying that he was surprised by this. And he's had stronger criticism, as you rightly pointed out, reserved for the UK and for NATO allies in particular. He's described them as cowards for not contributing. So he is lashing out, and we're seeing much of the same as what we've seen, kind of efforts to appease Trump directly, but also some stronger language. Like Keir Starmer seems to be kind of finding his spine a bit, was saying that, he won't, effectively saying that he won't buckle under the pressure that Trump is putting him under. He's not going to kind of cave to a bully. Our colleague Ellen Beam did say to me, the fact that he seems to be finding his spine is just a reminder that he didn't have one. But maybe in some ways, like if we're looking for optimism, it is somewhat heartening that the Australian government hasn't been immediately drawn. Of course, we're already involved, as we've discussed, but hasn't been immediately drawn further in, and also I think hasn't been drawn into responding too much to Trump's comments, like as much as the Australian right-wing media is desperate for them to do that. They haven't fallen into that trap.
Despite all of that, I guess the core of the relationship between Australia and the United States continues unchanged. AUKUS, at least rhetorically, continues apace, even if there's no actual submarines being built, as far as we can tell. And so a senior defence official at a security conference last week, hosted by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, complained about the relentless politicisation of AUKUS. Emma, are you being mean to the security boys?
Yes, Angus, I am being mean on purpose and deliberately hurting their feelings. Yeah, look, this did get a bit of attention because this is a senior bureaucrat in defence complaining about this politicisation of AUKUS, which he described as a bipartisan issue, as in like there's bipartisan consensus, so therefore that should be the end of it.
As if that means anything with the coalition polling at like what percent?
Exactly, like not even a viable opposition party. But it is just kind of reflective, I think, of that, exactly as you described, that old framework, or that old way of thinking about how politics works in Australia. But also it's just an indication of how annoyed defence types are when there's even a hint of scrutiny of what they're doing, when there's even a hint that normies might dare to have an opinion about the national security and sovereignty of Australia. They get really shirty, which, I in a way, like, I think is probably an indication that the evidence-based criticism of the AUKUS submarine deal is cutting through. There were other comments, I thought, made by this official and others that were pretty revealing about, the department has been directed to implement AUKUS, and so that is what we're doing. So they're not being drawn in. But also just some kind of, I think, on the face of it, ridiculous things like, we shouldn't politicise AUKUS because if we don't go through with AUKUS, we'll get no submarines. Like, this is the only option. When, like, even if we do go through with AUKUS, it's fairly likely we're not going to get any submarines.
Yeah. Option A and B might be no submarines. And I mean, this is the third attempt at a submarine program, so maybe a bit of scrutiny is in order, no?
Yeah. I mean, you'd think so. Yes.
Yeah. Third, right? That's right. Japan, France, US.
Japan, Japanese subs, French subs, and now US subs. And, defence types will often use that as an argument that we can't change again because we've already changed too many times. And people will think that Australia is unreliable, contractually speaking, which, yes.
Yeah, but then somehow the focus of it becomes the contract. Like, obviously that's important and you want to look like a reliable partner. You actually want to be a reliable partner. But, I mean, surely the priority is
the delivery.
The delivery of some assets for the billions of dollars that you...
Yeah, well, not when you work in defence.
Billions, schmillions.
Yeah. But all of this as well is, indicative of a much bigger problem, right, that we talk about all the time where, it's not just officials, but it's elected representatives as well, including and up to like the highest levels of government, the Prime Minister, refusing to name reality, like refusing to acknowledge the problems of AUKUS, refusing still to acknowledge, the catastrophe that is the Trump administration for Australian security, for the security of the world. And when you refuse to do that, when you refuse to name what people can see happening in front of them, when you refuse to acknowledge the most basic truths and play this kind of game, you leave the playing field wide open for people who are willing to reflect what people are seeing back at them. And I think in that sense, actually, Andrew Hastie is a real risk for the government because he seems to be, I mean, obviously the Greens are talking about this and have been for a long time, but that's fairly predictable, Hastie is not so much. Like, Hastie is actually out there saying the international rules-based order is over. Donald Trump has told us that, and we need to listen to him and respond accordingly. Now, I think I'm safe in saying you and I wouldn't necessarily agree with his prescription for how to respond and the role that Australia should play.
Yeah, what's next part, yeah.
Exactly. But the important thing is that he's actually saying, well, people might be losing trust in the US alliance.
As a close friend of the United States, I think that we can be honest and we can ask hard questions.
And are you worried that Australians' support for the US alliance is also being weakened by all of this?
I think so, and I think the economic pain is going to be more acute, and they're going to question the judgment of the president as this drags on.
I mean, for a Liberal to say that is hugely significant in the face of a Labor Party that is unwilling to even kind of contemplate what that might mean. I think that's really significant because Hastie is right in that sense. Like, we've done the polling to say that people are losing faith in the Trump administration. They're seeing it as a direct threat to Australian security. We've got some new numbers back that we aren't ready to share publicly yet, but, they support this argument pretty strongly. And so I think that's, again, it's a real risk for democracies everywhere, like not just in Australia, that refuse to acknowledge how quickly the world is changing.
Yeah. I guess could be a signal too to governments, not just this one, but to actually engage on the issue, and the tactic of, just letting it all wash over you and it all be bipartisan and blah, blah, blah.
Getting visibly annoyed when people dare to suggest that maybe that's not the case.
It doesn't necessarily work in this situation where, our most important security ally is so comprehensively trashing everything that came before. Emma, that's all we've got time for this week. We are going to be taking a little break. We came back earlier this year than we expected.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have a little break over Easter, and we'll be back in a fortnight, potentially with some of those polling numbers that we were just talking about. But thanks so much for joining me today, Emma.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Angus.
My pleasure, and thanks so much for listening. If you want some light reading over the break, Emma's essay on the Australia-US relationship has just gone to reprint, which is really exciting. So After America, Australia and the New World Order is available from Australia Institute Press for $19.95. Pod listeners can use the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout to get free shipping. Thank you everyone who's written in the last couple of weeks, and sorry we haven't gotten back to you yet. We've had a bunch more emails than we usually do. But you can reach us via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday the 30th of March, and After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. Speak to you all in a fortnight after we've both had way too much chocolate. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.